morning, good evening. So welcome everybody, all of you from all parts of the world. And thank you again, and thank to the organizers, AAP, UCAD, University Sharon Job, and Michigan State University, for putting together this important webinar on climate adaptation for African cities. So before introducing the panelists one by one, I just want to share with you and shape the context. We all know that since the pre-industrial era, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions has increased substantially and has impacted ecosystems and society all over the world. So Africa is described as a continent the most at risk to the negative effects of climate change because of amplitude of expected changes, and of course because of the level of vulnerability. Of course, the rate of the global warming, the rate of the increase of the global warming has generally been more rapid also in Africa than the global average, with, of course, this human-induced climate change being the dominant driver of this global warming. Hot extremes are projected to continue throughout the 21st century, meaning that have very negative effects on society and all the livelihoods, and of course for also the cities. The intensity and frequency of heavy precipitation events are projected to increase, and we all know what is already happening nowadays in many parts of the world, but including and mainly in Africa, in the big cities and capitals. But can be no single approach to adapt to climate change. Rather, we can look at range of adaptation actions. So, of course, there's an increasing demand of better governance, and also an increasing demand of adapting population, the economy, and of course the cities to climate change. So I'm then happy to be moderating this very important panel with the people coming from various sectors and universities. So let me give the floor to the first panelist. I'm looking at the panel. So the panelist, it's the first panelist here, who is Hassan Bey. Hassan Bey is a researcher at University Sharon Job of Dakar, and Hassan Bey, then I give you the floor to share in 10 minutes with the audience your thoughts about this very important theme on climate adaptation for African cities. Hassan Bey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Gaye. Je vais faire la présentation.
I will now present in French. We do have interpreters, so the slides are in English. This will allow the other people to better follow. So the presentation we'll be having today is on the relationship between climate change.
Elle est confie au Sahel. Donc, c'est une présentation.
Conflicts in the Sahel region. And this is a presentation I prepared with the Vice Chancellor, Professor Ali Mbaye, who Sahel DAP, he would like to apologize for not being here to attend this very major event. So the objective of this presentation is trying to see the linkages that may exist between these three items. We'll try to see how climate change may impact. May inflate conflicts in the Sahel region. Next slide, please. So this is the outline. So we'll be presenting the background, Sahel region, and then this will be followed. We'll look into climate change and livelihoods and the Sahel region, the linkages. Then we'll be looking into the hypotheses and evidences of the link between these three items, and then we'll be looking into policy options. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. First, we wanted to present what we mean by the Sahel region, because there are many interpretations of this word Sahel. There's no unanimity between the various regions concerning definition of the Sahel region. So when we talk about Sahel region, it includes all countries from Senegal all the way down to Sudan, with countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Chad. So the presentation that we'll be having is on mainly this part of Africa. Next slide, please. Well, by way of introduction, we'll be looking into Sahelian economies. What are the features? What characterizes the economies of these countries? We'll be we'll be showing that in general, they have the same features. They're similar to those in sub-Saharan African region. But the exception is that there are some features, special features that define these countries. In particular, you have the fertility rates in Niger. We know that it's a country which has the highest birth rate in the world. Also, you have this strong presence of a young population. It's a very young population. This youth is also characterized by unemployment, joblessness, and underemployment. And third feature is poverty incidence, which is very high in these regions, in these countries. So more than 80% of the population is living with less than $2 per day. So this economic context is characterized also by challenges, security challenges through borders, across borders, because of political tensions that exist within countries, also with the development of radical Islamism, but also because of poor governance. So all these factors are exacerbated by climate change, which exacerbate these issues that have been identified within those countries. Next slide, please. Well, now in order to characterize, in the same vein, here we're presenting a few facts. These will show the importance of farming, agriculture. Here we have a graph that shows the relationship that exists between the percentage of the added value that is generated from agriculture and the GDP per person. This graph shows us that in general, countries that are not developed are those countries where the contribution of agriculture is very low. So countries like the United States, Malaysia, etc. These are countries where the GDP per capita is very high, but the contribution for farming is not very high. So these are countries that really made the transition from agriculture to industry. So in right-hand side, you have African countries where the GDP per capita is very low, but GDP per capita, which is low, is correlated with a contribution which is quite high to those countries. When you take the case of Niger, we're at the level of 40% of the GDP of Niger. It depends on the agricultural sector. In the same way, this country is characterized by a very low level of GDP per capita. I just want to show the relation, the correlation, negative correlation that exists between GDP per capita and added value contribution of this farming sector and the formation of the GDP. Next slide, please. Well, it will try to show how agriculture depends on rainfall, because when we look into the evolution of these two graphs, in blue color you have the cereals, grains, and in green color you have the variability, rainfall variability. We realize that the two graphs are following the same trend. So the performance, agricultural performance are strongly dependent on rainfall. Each and every time we have a very interesting rainfall, we then will have a good agricultural performance. And when rainfall is not very good, we realize that there is low agricultural performances. Please proceed. Next slide, please. This is a graph that shows the long-term trends of rainfall in Niger. We took the case of this country, but it's quite representative of the countries in the South region, because generally speaking, we realize that as compared to early century, we can see that there's a trend, a low trend, low rainfall in this region. Next slide, please. Well, another salient fact in Africa, even though Africa is widely impacted by rainfall, Africa is issues lots of gas emissions. So when we look here into the contributions vis-a-vis other continents, as compared to other continents, we realize that Africa contributes very little as compared to the United States of America, or as compared to Europe or China, etc. So Africa will contribute very greatly to the emission of carbon gas, which is behind climate change. But also, next slide, please. We'll realize also that Africa is hit the hardest hit. So this graph shows the way the various regions are impacted by climate change. And here we realize in Africa, we have African countries, even though they do not contribute to the formation of greenhouse gas emissions, these countries are really paying the highest brunt, really. Next slide, please. Now we're seeing here how these changes, these climate changes are felt locally. At local level, these impacts are manifested through an increase of competition toward resources. Here we have the example of the Niger River. It's a resource which is impacted by climate change, but still this resource is useful for farmers, for breeders and fishers. So climate changes will lead to a reduction of the availability of this resource, of this water, and increases competition toward these resources. So this competition toward these resources, we'll see that this competition toward these resources will be leading to a rise of conflicts in the region, in the Sahel region, in those African countries. Next slide, please. Well, here you have a picture, an idea of terrorism, how it's felt in Saharan countries. In red, we have territories where you have conflicts. These are territories that are characterized by borders, boundaries. It's a terrorism that is developed mainly at border level, because these are zones that are characterized by porous borders, and it's very hard to really control. Next slide, please. Well, here we are. This is a theory that was developed in 2019 that shows how from climate changes, you have migration that is behind. So climate changes is manifested mainly through droughts, poor productivity, etc. These manifestation of climate changes will push population to migrate. When populations do migrate, then they will find that there were local communities and the competitions that are behind access to those resources will exacerbate conflict. So of course, there's a link between climate changes that push people into migrating. So when people migrate in order to go to other places, there will be a rise and increase of local competition with limited resources, etc. So the competition for those resources will skyrocket, will speed up. Next slide, please. Well, here we're showing a few hypotheses and evidences of the link between climate change, livelihoods, and conflicts. So you have manifestations that are important of instability, like terrorism, protestation, so ethnic violence, rebellions, etc., and wars. These manifestations will trigger various factors like favoritism, corruption, wars, for access to those resources. These factors are amplified by other factors like marginalization, political marginalization of certain ethnic groups, but also the fact that certain leaders do not really address the needs of marginalized population, those populations that are in those border. So the lack of the public presence creates frustrations that push certain populations to joining terrorist groups, for example. Next slide, please. Here we present the channel through which climate change may exacerbate conflicts, the rise of temperatures and dropping rainfall. These lead to droughts, the rise of the level of the sea, migrations. These factors are indeed the speed up for social fragmentation. The social fragmentation combined with low governance will lead to frustrations among those marginalized populations that are very vulnerable. In face of all this observation, next slide, please. In face of all this, we have tried to identify a few policy options that will make it possible to addressing those issues. So these policy options are done thanks to two channels that are mitigation and adaptation. In general, there are more economists that are in favor of mitigation because it's more universal, and this allows countries, developed countries that are mainly responsible of climate changes, to helping countries that are underdeveloped, so they can really handle their economies. You have carbon markets, clean development mechanisms, etc. These are mechanisms that allow developed countries to support underdeveloped countries in their willingness to mitigating the impacts of climate change. And next to that mitigation, you have adaptation that allows certain countries to underdeveloped countries to have access to funds, grants like green funds that make it possible for them to fund projects, development projects that are environmental friendly or that reduce the impact of climate change. Next slide, please. Okay, well, here we do revisit once again a graph done by Allow that dates back to 2011 that shows that the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of action. So if you do not really address, if you remain idle, if you do not get committed, in other words, if you do not really address the needs of those populations, the cost of inaction in the long term, this cost of inaction will be higher as compared to the cost of action. So it's simpler, in other words, for government to take measures, drastic measures, in order to addressing the needs of those populations, rather than waiting until the impact of climate change is felt and then address those very problems. Very last slide. Next slide, please. Again, we're showing the various approaches that allow countries to, the various tools that may allow countries to mitigate climate changes. So we have four. You have tools that make it possible to reduce risk. We mentioned some of those. We also have tools that will allow adaptation to those risks, and then we have transfer of risk, that this can be done through a market mechanism or other financial mechanism. So it's an example plan that will make it possible to mitigate climate changes. I think that was the very last slide. I would like to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Hassan Bey.
Continue our discussion. So I will really beg the panelists to really try to keep in the allocated time, 10 minutes. So let me give now the floor to our second panelist. So I think it's where is the banner, please? The banner, please. Okay, so Kulthum Omari Motsumi, so she's a special advisor in the Africa Adaptation Initiative. So Kulthum Omaru Motsumi, so if you are here, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you to the organizers, AAP, for inviting me to this dialogue. I'm excited to be part of this initiative, and I'm hoping to share some of the lessons across, regional and local experiences from the continent. Perhaps before I even go into that, I would like to take a few minutes just to talk about the Africa Adaptation Initiative, because I think it links very well with the previous speaker. If you could go to the next slide, please. And just give you an introduction about the Africa Adaptation Initiative. So as Dr. Bey rightly articulated about the importance of adaptation in Africa, our heads of state at the AU African Union level have taken a step to address this adaptation gap, what we call adaptation gap, and launched the Africa Adaptation Initiative, which is called the AAI. This was created in 2015, and since then I've been the coordinator for that initiative, and now the special advisor of the initiative. And essentially, this is a head of state level initiative that is going to be implemented in all African countries. But essentially, it's looking at how to enhance action on adaptation, particularly adaptation support. It was launched by the President of Egypt, His Excellency El-Sisi, and as at that time, he was the chair of CAOS, which is an organ of the African Union. So just as a background of what it is and why we're interested in going into cities is because that's one of the areas that we see that in Africa, we need concerted effort in addressing climate challenges within cities. Next slide, please. So the African continent, briefly about cities and the impacts of climate change. The African continent will lead the world's population growth over the next 50 years, as we know. And the people of Africa will increasingly be city dwellers, as we call them, meaning that Africa will have some of the largest megacities in the world. And it is anticipated that urbanization will increase from 43% to 59% by 2050. That's quite large considering what we have right now is less than 40%. Now, this urbanization is occurring in cities that are least equipped in terms of governance, in terms of infrastructure, and in terms of the economy to absorb this staggering growth in population. And you tend to see that those people that have moved into urban areas move into slums and informal settlements. And the population in those slums and informal settlements is around 28% of that population earn a stable income, and about 63% are in insecure jobs. Therefore, that level of inequality, that level of high levels of slums and informal settlement in our cities in Africa, and particularly we tend to see that the slum dwellers reside in high-risk locations within the city, often on marginal lands, avoided by regulatory property developers, and they lack the requisite infrastructure and services to withstand climate change, as what was articulated earlier. And in addition to that, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report on the impacts of global warming, has actually highlighted the urban areas and infrastructure, meaning the cities, will need unprecedented transformation in order to deal with or to have an equitable, low carbon and climate resilient future. So it is one of the key questions, key sectors that have been identified based on the IPCC report. Therefore, failure to adapt will come at a cost, as we will see in a few minutes. And I will use the case of Cape Town and Nairobi to just illustrate that. And again, the key question now is how can African cities build resilience to these climate impacts that were articulated by Dr. Beye in the previous presentation. Next slide, please. So I'll start with the Cape Town drought. As many of you know, I think it was talked about quite a lot, and some of you may know it as the Cape Town drought, Day Zero drought. It was famously known for that. Now, the city of Cape Town has over 4 million people. However, 14% of the population is resident in informal housing. However, when you look at the population in terms of water, because I'm going to talk about water in this case, it's only 4% of the informal settlement, of the entire population of Cape Town that has access to water, which are residing in the informal areas. There's been a large number of urbanization movement to these large metropolitan areas, contributing to what the housing challenge that Cape Town now faces. Again, when you look at climate change in Cape Town, Cape Town is a semi-arid country. And for the past 3 years, before the droughts, there was rainfall deficient. In addition to that, there was poor water management, and there's currently infrastructure deficiency. Therefore, Cape Town was the first major city to run out of water because of the drought that was over a period of 3 years. The dam levels, which supplies 99% of water in Cape Town, dropped from 100% to 71 to 60 to 38. And when they eventually called it Day Zero, it was at 13.5% of the dam levels. And based on the studies that were done thereafter, it showed that indeed climate change did contribute to this drought. Of course, there are other factors such as governance and so on that I'll talk about, but climate change was the major factor. Now, how did Cape Town respond to this? They had various technical and institutional interventions that they came up with. Some of it were around restricting water usage to 50 liters a day. And when it went to 13.5%, which was called day zero, they went up to 25 liters a day in terms of water restrictions. There were other interventions such as desalination and plants and so on. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about the various interventions that South Africa, particularly the city of Cape Town, including the Department of Water Affairs, engaged in. And I apologize if the text is quite small, but essentially you could see that there was a lot of intervention from the time 2017 when the leadership of the city declared drought, declared actually a disaster, declared Cape Town a local disaster area, and established a team and so on and so forth. I won't go into the details of this, but I'll just highlight a few things. One of it is that one of the interventions to deal with the water scarcity and drought was to develop emergency desalination plants within the city. And you can see with time, based on the expertise that were then sourced for the city of Cape Town, that intervention was seen as not sufficient, and there were other interventions that came about. So there was a lot of interventions, like I said, institutionally as well as technically, that were thought of, and I'll talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from how Cape Town dealt with its drought and water scarcity for the 2016-2017 drought. Next slide, please. The next case, very quickly, I see that I don't have a lot of time left, is Kenya, Nairobi. Again, just like any other African city, urbanization is within the region of 28, which is quite low compared to the global African average. But then 60% of the population is based in informal areas. Climate change affects the Nairobi, particularly in the form of floods, and leading to loss of lives, loss of damage, loss of property, and socioeconomic disruption amongst the urban dwellers. Next slide, please. And as you can see here, a picture on the top left shows some of the damage that for property and life that was caused by the floods in Nairobi. And on the right is one of the interventions that was established, which is to source groundwater for water supply in Nairobi. Next slide, please. And then the way Kenya dealt with these issues is that they developed key programs. So they developed national programs to build resilience for the urban poor. They developed programs to identify hotspots for the vulnerable areas and build, improve infrastructure and so on and so forth. So there are various programs that they did. But I would like to spend a little bit more time talking about the lessons, which I will talk about in the next slide. What have we learned from the way Nairobi as well as Cape Town dealt with these impacts at the city level? Please go to the next slide. Right. First thing is we need a systems approach. By that, I mean looking at the entire system in its totality. Like you were able to see that in Cape Town, most of the water was surface water. Groundwater was an unexplored area for many of the years, as well as water from the sea, therefore desalination. Therefore, when you're looking at a problem, trying to address a problem, it helps to look at the entire problem in a very holistic, systematic way in order to adapt. Governance is also one of the key lessons that we've learned looking at these two cases. Strong leadership is definitely would enable adaptation. By this, I mean, in the case of Cape Town, where we had the mayor coming out to say, this is a national disaster and we need to act. We also learned about partnerships which means beyond the city. So not just working with the city officials. In the case of Cape Town, we also saw that they're working with media to ensure that the people are educated. There's awareness raising. They're working with NGOs. They're working with the World Bank. So going beyond the governance system within the city is quite key. Another thing that we see in the case of Nairobi is they have developed policies and strategies in order to deal with these impacts. In the case of Cape Town, they also through this process developed what they call the water resource strategy based on the lessons that they've learned from this crisis. Data and communication. In the case of Cape Town as well, it was important to have sufficient data in the form that is usable, but then when they realized that there's not sufficient data from the businesses in terms of water users, they were able to source that data so that you look at the entire problem in its holistic way. And linked to the second point is engaging with experts. They engaged with researchers, which is important for this conversation. They also engaged with World Bank experts and so on and so forth. Again, education, how do you educate in partnership with media and campaigners? Next slide, please. I think that's my last slide. Sorry, I'm taking 2 minutes longer. In the case of Nairobi, they started these cleanup campaigns because, as you know, because of the river that runs across Nairobi where the slums are located, they will block, and when there's rains and so on and the river flows, this becomes a problem for the urban dwellers, and of course infrastructure development. And I would like to end my presentation by saying, again, partnership, collaboration is important, particularly with researchers and academic institutions, so that to understand better, because this is a new area that Africa we're trying to deal with, so that we're able to replicate. And this is where the AAI comes in a way that we can replicate these successful, or at least these lessons across the continent. I would like to end my presentation here. If you could just go to the next slide, I just want to see, and acknowledge just that some of the case studies, I got the information from these two individuals and they can be contacted there. And thank you very much, and apologies for going extra time.
Thank you so much, Kulthum, for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure the questions and will be flowing. So now let us continue. So I'm now going to give the floor to Papa Saho. Papa Saho is a professor at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. So Papa Saho, tu as la parole.
Over to you, Papa Saho. Thank you, moderator. Thank you equally to Cheikh Anta Diop University. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with the community on the relationship between African cities, development policies, and adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. Well, the moderator, I believe that my colleagues, my predecessors said it all. They already talked about some of these topics I'll be looking into, but Dr. Bey talked about the Sahel region, the continental space, Africa. If we look into the organization of space of cities, it's the coastline mainly, which is connected to an entry to globalization. Just trying to revisit in history, because now most of these large cities are the products of globalization, with ports, diversity of services, international multinationals, exchange of goods, beach tourism, and cities that are more larger and larger. The lady just talked about that when she mentioned the case of Cape Town or the case of Nairobi, Kenya. So the impact, the consequence of this is that there's a strong urbanization coastline, on the coastline. Next slide, please. Well, the manifestations of climate change in Africa, once again, I'm not going to revisit this issue. The last report of IPCC gives us a diagram that said that subtropical regions, rural regions, will be impacted by the modification of the distribution of rainfall, and also it's projected to having a drop in rainfall and also variation, and that will come in on monsoon based on regions, according to regions. Climate resources on the one hand, and also rainfall resources. On the other hand, you have coastal zones, a rise on the level of the sea that will be perpetuated, rise of increase of floods in low lands, accentuation of coastal erosion, and also episodes of extreme marine sea levels that will be increased. So the question we're asking to ourselves, what's the future? In face of all these climate changes, what's the future of African cities? Next slide, please. Please proceed. Here. Madam Omar already talked about one of the issues, adaptations, current adaptations that are undertaken in major cities. You have the water strategy in Cape Town, which is also just gives you an idea. So these are all adaptations, intra-urban adaptations. So the phenomenon is localized within the city. We're trying to addressing the problem within that city. You have the case of Nairobi as well. Desalination also, when we take the case of Dakar or as well. And then you have development of major infrastructures, canalization, networks of channels, retention basins, reservoirs, protection structures, protect the coastline. These are developments in general. But in general, the solution has to do with proximity displacement of population. In other words, you have the relocation of those populations. These are in other words, most of these adaptations are intra-urban adaptations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The other piece, the other part that was addressed by Mr. Bay, has to do with interior domestic adaptations that look into rural activities. When ended his talk, I was thinking about this because in the Sahel, in the interior of the Sahel region, you have cities, but the main focus of adaptations are on agricultural things, on the management of conflicts, but we do not insist on small cities of the interior. Those cities are really going through that. So we also talked about individual adaptations. We have new strategies that are developed here and there. So, but all this is based on, as he rightly put it, is based on resources that are over-dependent on climate variations. And the last form of adaptation has to do with migration, rural urban migration. Concerning Cape Town, it was mentioned the issue of those populations that do have precarious jobs, that live in informal habitats, but these populations will increase because the other aspect of climate change is that this will push or rural populations in small villages of the interior, they will be prompted into moving to coastline cities. Next slide, please. Please, next slide. Okay, well, the impacts, the consequences of all this, either in small cities of the interior or in major cities and major coastline cities across the board, we may see a rise of risk connected to climate change. For coastline cities, you have the rise of population, vulnerable populations connected or related to migration due to climate change, etc., etc. And then you have the pressure on land, on real estate, because the solution is to relocating people on site. And the third piece, a lady talked about Cape Town. How? What will be the cost element? The investment, the cost element, the investment, how much it's going to cost in order to really undertake adaptation in those coastline cities. The consequence is that this will be costly on national budgets, but also will be having challenges in finding resources that are needed in order to adapt, also in small cities. Or in cities of the interior that are whose economies are based on farming, agriculture, or whose economies are based on natural resources. When you have a drop of resources, a drop of revenues, then this will lead to the vitality of the economy of those cities. What we realize is that most of our cities of the interior do have a summary development project. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, to wrap up, in my humble opinion, as was mentioned by Ms. Omari, we'll have to cross-cultural. This is new piece, new land, new area, but I'm saying that in any case, all things being equal, we have to, or rather, the space, the African space, the continental space, the interland space cannot be only based on an adaptation, but through the improvement or the exploitation of resources that are dependent on climate resources only, but also coastline cities will not be able to handle that problem, because you have the consequence is that there will always be a new population coming in, vulnerable population coming in, so the risk will be exacerbated. So the idea here is that now, as I speak, we'll have to give regions of the hinterland, real cities, the conditions, the resources, so they can really develop urban spaces that are sustainable and that are also and that are inclusive, so that those that are energy efficient, so that this population can have the opportunity to not migrate and not go and increase the risk of that already exists in major cities, the risk that exists in those big coastline cities. So, in a nutshell, so we have to reverse the trend, in other words, of urbanization, and climate change, in other words, gives us an opportunity to try and increase the growth rate in coastline cities, but in the hinterland, but also to having a new urbanization, which will be an urbanization which is sustainable, an urbanization which is based on low energy consumption, etc. I think this will be a way to be connected to globalization, but we can trigger it differently through another approach. These are the few words I want to share with the House. So I'm done. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Dear colleague, Papa Sako, thank you for your remarks, for sharing your thoughts on this very vital topic.
Let us move to the next presenter. Actually, it will be the last one, but not the least. So let me give the floor to Azir Dalton. He's assistant professor at the Department of Forestry at Michigan State University. So Azir Dalton, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for the opportunity to speak at this great event today. I am going to be sharing with you some of the observations and recent developments on the state of urban forestry in the United States, and speaking about it specifically from the perspective of urban forests and their resilience in city planning. So we'll spend the time reviewing some background information on urban forests and urban forestry in general here in the United States. And then we'll launch into some examples of what's being done to implement urban forestry initiatives at various levels of government. And then I'll wrap up with some recommendations that may be helpful for implementation in cities across the African continent. Next slide, please. So when we think about the word urban forestry, I always like to take a minute to just ask folks, what comes to mind? What is an urban forest? Is it a city that exists in a forest? Or is it a forest that exists in a city? Or does that term, does that definition encompass things that are a little bit beyond those two interpretations? And so this is an image of a city on the west coast of the United States. This is Portland, Oregon. And, you know, some would argue that Portland is a city that exists within a larger forest. But thinking about the definition of urban forestry, here in the United States, or I should say urban forest, we have been using a definition that's been around for about 20 years. Next slide, please. And that definition is that an urban forest is all publicly and privately owned trees within an urban area. This may include individual trees that exist along streets and in backyards, as well as stands of remnant forests that may have been left untouched despite the development that may have taken place as a given area was becoming more and more urbanized. Now, the interesting thing about urban forests here in the United States and really around the world is that if you have an opportunity to engage with an urban space, maybe through touring or living there, visiting family, you'll be able to see the trees, acknowledge their presence, maybe even appreciate their presence for various reasons. But one thing that doesn't frequently cross our minds is that there is a difference between those trees that are publicly owned and privately owned. And in the United States, our urban forests are split in such a way that about 90% of all trees that exist in cities are actually present on private land. And only about 10% of trees that exist in cities are present on public land. And so as we begin to think about, first and foremost, what an urban forest is, and then secondly, what its utility is in terms of increasing a city's resilience given predicted changes in climate, we begin to think about what the managerial challenges may be if we want to utilize all urban trees for this climate resilience good, but only have public access to 10%. There's challenges that arise there. There are great challenges. And like one of my colleagues mentioned in an earlier talk, opportunities. These present opportunities for us to begin partnering with various people between academia, private land ownership, public land management. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as I continue. But before I go any further, I just want to provide a few examples of how you might see an urban forest. And I'll show some examples in both the United States and Africa. Next slide, please. So in the United States, you know, again, we're looking at urban forests. These are trees that exist in public and private lands. So I have some examples from where I'm joining you from today, which is the greater Lansing metropolitan area. And you can see in Lansing, our urban forests include trees that may be on cemetery property, and this example is a publicly operated cemetery. They include trees that may be on large commercial properties like the grounds for hospitals. I have a picture here of the grounds of our university, Michigan State University, and it's a campus with about 22,000 trees. All of those are part of the urban forest. I have a picture also from Pittsburgh, which is a city in Pennsylvania on towards the east coast of the United States. And you can see here the urban forest showing up in the form of trees that exist in the median of a roadway. So sort of creating a vegetated space in the midst of impervious cover, in the midst of roadways, in the midst of shopping districts. And then an example here from Yamoussoukro and Côte d'Ivoire. And we can see here that this is an example of a forest that was once present before urbanization that was developed around. And even though it's not necessarily comprised of trees that were individually planted one at a time, it's still a representation of all of what comprises the urban forest. And then our final example to the right of the slide is in Manhattan or New York City. In New York on the east coast of the United States. Oops, sorry. And you can see here that these urban trees are part of a park, a very, very small park on a very, very small piece of land in a city with a lot of development, a lot of people. But even in this small area of land, these trees that are present are part of what we consider the urban forest. And so again, it just begins to, seeing these different examples helps us to think about the fact that all the trees that exist in our cities are part of the urban forest, and they all contribute to the overall delivery of ecosystem services and various benefits that we are relying on them to provide for the sake of creating resilience to both urbanization and the predicted changes in climate. Next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about what those ecosystem services are, this has been a priority in the United States for the better part of the past 2 decades. And the justification behind that is essentially linked to the fact that there has been a growing awareness of the previous decades of unsustainable urban development, the related negative impacts that has had on environmental quality and quality of life in our cities, and a keen desire to switch that so that as the climate changes, we're not susceptible to even more accelerated degradation of the environment. And so there's been a lot of research that's been done to identify what are the benefits of having trees in our cities, and how can we use knowledge of these benefits to begin to strategize and prioritize planting more trees and managing them over the course of their lifetime. And so these benefits range from air quality improvement to reducing heat or exacerbated temperatures in our cities, to also helping to manage stormwater. So we saw some of the examples from Kenya with the flooding. Here in the United States, there's been a lot of emphasis on planting urban trees to help mitigate flooding that occurs and is oftentimes amplified in our cities. And we've also been doing a lot of work to look at the related health implications of having trees in our cities, and have noted and have made substantial progress in identifying that the presence of trees can be linked to improved mental health conditions, as well as physical health conditions, with obesity rates, rates of cardiovascular disease, and rates of respiratory illness found to be lower in cities that have a higher urban tree canopy. Next slide, please. So in addition to the work that's been done to identify what those benefits of urban trees are, there's also been a lot of work done to assign an economic value to those benefits. And I have with you now a table of the annual recognized value of trees for providing various services in cities across the United States. And some of these cities are on the west coast of the United States, so in the California area. Some are in the south, and some are on the East Coast. I tried to have cities that are well representative of the country. But you can see that for many cities, there is a significant financial benefit to the services that these trees provide, including reducing energy savings, or increasing energy savings, which is directly linked to climate change, because in the presence of urban trees, you have a greater degree of cooling that occurs, and that reduces the need to use heating or cooling systems in our cities, thereby reducing CO2 emissions. In addition to that, the trees that are present actually help to sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that has significant, or can have significant, financial impacts that are positive. And then there are also linked benefits to the air quality. And if you notice, for many cities, the stormwater mitigation benefit that urban trees provide can be substantial. So for example, in New York City, because of the presence of urban trees, because of the role they play in mitigating stormwater, there's about $33 million saved annually in reducing stormwater treatment costs. So as I'm running out of time, I'll sort of speed through the next couple slides, but I just wanted to share that all of these benefits that urban trees provide, next slide please, are important, specifically as we think about climate change and what climate change will mean for conditions in cities. There are predictions that cities will become warmer, that will have more frequent or extreme weather events, that air quality may likely decrease or be degraded. And so just as we can note the benefits of trees in general, it's important to note what their benefits are as we think about planning for urban resilience and maybe including trees in our cities more strategically to meet those needs that we're going to need in terms of resilience. Next slide, please. So in the United States, with all of this background information, there have been initiatives at local levels, at the level of individual states, and then at the federal level to apply this knowledge to strategic planning of our urban forests across the country. And so I'll highlight a federal example. About 30 years ago, we had the formation of a National Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council. And every year, every 10 years, the Advisory Council identifies pressing needs for urban forest management across the nation and puts that forth as a way to guide prioritization of urban forest initiatives. And so we're in the middle of our current 10-year plan, and you can see that we have 7 goals that we as a nation are being advised to work towards regarding our urban forest management, including better planning, linking urban forest management to human health, and also looking at how do we adequately fund urban forestry initiatives across the United States, among other goals. Next slide, please. We also see that at the state scale, there are different initiatives. There are 50 states across the United States, and the state level application of urban forest management will vary in terms of what is prioritized, how funding is allocated. I'll give you an example of here in Michigan. We have different needs than perhaps what they may need their urban forest for or use their urban forest for in Florida. But here in Michigan, there's a prioritization of making funding available to various communities to empower their ability to manage their urban forests. And so funding is made available on an annual basis through competitive grants, and the municipalities, the towns are allowed to use that funding to lead their own initiatives regarding planting of trees, management of urban trees, educating and training the public on how to manage urban trees, and then planning for that long-term successional planning of your urban forest cover. Next slide, please. And then on the local level, we have individual cities, both large and small, that develop and implement urban forest management plans. And having these plans are very key to the effective, sustainable management of our urban forest, especially if you want to utilize that forest to create or bolster climate resilience in your cities. And so as cities move forward with developing and implementing these urban forest management plans, it's key that they identify reasonable goals and objectives, conduct a needs assessment to determine based on the goals, what do we need in terms of human resources, financial resources, equipment resources, and then clearly identifying what are the actions that we're going to need to take to reach these goals. And I think that these lessons from the models of urban forest management planning that we have in the United States can be applied in African cities. Next and last slide, please. And so I just wanted to go through a few lessons that I think could be applicable. Number one, if you're working in an African city and you're wanting to manage urban forests for climate resilience, it's important to start with identifying the goals for urban tree cover in terms of how many trees do you want? How do you want them to be distributed across your city? What are the goals that we need, the ecosystem service goals that we need this urban forest to meet? It's important to inventory the resource, know what you have, how many trees are present, what species are present, and knowing that will help you to determine how to plant, how to select tree species, where to plant moving forward, and then how to manage those trees so that they can live really their full lifespan. And last but not least, as was mentioned earlier, it's so important to engage stakeholders from various levels of government, from academia, from the community, to ensure that everyone has an active voice in determining what decisions need to be made and how they'll be carried out. So with that, next slide, please. I just want to say thank you to my collaborators at Michigan State University and the Forest Carbon and Climate Program who helped with this presentation, and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative for providing funding for the work that we're doing in this line, and welcome any questions that may come later. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Azir. So it is very, very interesting, and I think you will have some questions related to your experience in managing urban forests in the US and developing dam resilience and also planning. So now we still have some, I will say 20 minutes or even 15 minutes, less than that, to have some discussion and Q&A. We had already some questions, and I will give chance to the panelists to answer to some of them. I don't know if you were able to find it out yourself. If not, I can just find some of them and raise them. And so feel free as a panelist, and I'm going to go around that and really feel free to answer or at least comment. So there's a lot of comments and very, very interesting suggestions from every part of the in Africa and also the world. So Hassan Bey, if you're still here, very precise questions from Regina Foloruncho. I don't know if you saw them. Hassan Bey, est-ce que vous avez vu?
Did you see the question that was, yes, I saw them already, right? If you may add something to that comment or question. So I try to address remarks on the chat, because the question is on the reason why climate change leads to conflicts in the Sahel region as compared to other regions. West Africa, yeah. West Africa, yeah. The problem is an interdisciplinary problem. I think we have to look into the features of those Sahelian countries. When you look into those countries, as I've tried to do in my presentation, these are countries that are characterized mainly by vulnerability of populations living in border levels with public policies that are more focused on urban cities versus rural cities. So this creates frustrations of those populations that feel they are marginalized and that are really at the mercy of terrorist groups. Or at the mercy of Islamists. So the second point that may explain this has to do with the youth, the young age. So we have very young populations. More than 65% of the population is less than 24. So if this population is not well trained, if this population doesn't really have enough skills, well, it will render really public action more challenging. There are initiatives that have been noted in the Sahel countries. We have the project of the Great Wall, Green green wall, but now we realize that this is a project that remains in the books because this concerns many countries. Those countries that were supposed to contribute did not really contribute as they were supposed to do in order to allow that project to flourish and gain momentum. Thank you. Thank you. If you have more questions or that you may identify, let me know.
Now, I will give chance to Kulsum. Kulsum, did you identify some question that you can answer?
Yes, and I really hope you can hear me because I had to change from my computer to my phone. Okay, great.
Fantastic.
I can't see the question at the moment, but when I read it, it read something along the lines of we need to consider sort of traditional ways, local ways of adaptation, and integrate that into our adaptation plans. And I would like to just say to the speaker, to the person who raised that question, I think it's important also to know that even at the climate change convention level, local knowledge and indigenous knowledge is key to adaptation. It's important that we understand how we, you know, however many years ago, we're able to deal with these climate impacts. However, and I would like to really stress this point, that we've never seen this kind of temperature increases and rainfall changes like it is right now. I mean, if you look at how much temperatures have increased from pre-industrial levels, globally it's 0.85 degrees. But for Africa, it could easily translate to between 2 to 4 degrees. And imagine what 2 to 4 degrees in terms of temperature increase will do to your agricultural systems and productivity. It will have immense impact in a negative way on your production systems, on food security, on water, and so on and so forth. So while I apologize, it's my phone, so the phone keeps coming. So while it's important to recognize local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, it's also important to know that our systems are not able to deal with this kind of climate changes as we used to in the past. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if you can answer also to this question. What could be the main adaptation measures of African cities in the face of sea level rise? I know you gave 2 examples of Cape Town and Nairobi. You didn't really talk about sea level rise, but I don't know if you think you can answer to that one. It's a large question, at least.
Right. So I think if you look at some of the lessons that I talked about, I highlighted the importance of planning and how that is important at the very, very beginning to understand the system in its entirety, so that you don't have people on in areas where potentially you could have sea level rise. However, that is not the case in Africa. In Africa, most of our cities, particularly those that are coastal cities, we have majority of the population that are living along the cities, along the coastal lines. So, some of these measures of identifying which are the best areas to relocate people, or which are the best areas to provide some residential housing and so on, may not be the best because there's already people living there. So they would need some sort of technologies in order to deal with sea level rise. A lot of infrastructure will have to be built along the sea level to deal with that, but it would be sort of post-impact, because we also don't want to deal with maladaptation. By maladaptation, I mean simply relocating people to areas and disrupting social cohesion and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex process, but it would require a lot of thinking and planning, as well as identifying what technologies and what infrastructure is needed in order to address those current impacts.
Okay. So, Dr. Azir, there's also a question of Alassane Traoré, so who is asking you if you think that a country like as Senegal, for instance, can implement forests in 6 months using phosphogypsum material, so to increase the roots of plants and subsequently the development of trees in the urban area. I don't know if you see that question, or what do you think about it?
I just saw that question. I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
So I think, not being very familiar with the soils in Senegal, I don't want to speak too authoritatively on like best fertilizers and what have you. But what I can say is that what we've learned here so far is that if your end goal is to plant trees, ensure that they are established well, and then actually have the opportunity to grow to maturity, before even planting, you want to be thinking about what are the soils. Based on the soils that are present in a location, in addition to other environmental factors such as, how warm it gets, how cold it gets, what are the trees that are likely to do well, and then based on the access to water, what do we know will do well? And I think if you have that information on the front end, it will be much more, it'll provide the guidance on what the best fertilization methods may be. One of the things that we've been working on here in the US that may or may not be of interest is really identifying which species are going to be the best given their intended planting location. So if you're going to be in a more undisturbed area, there's a little bit more flexibility with what you can plant. But for us, if we are planting trees along roadways, especially in areas where it's colder and we have to treat those roadways during the winter, we only plant tree species that are going to be tolerant to the conditions that they'll see during the winter, like excess road salts. So that's one thing to think about. And then this is just slightly divergent, but may also be of interest. We have various sites across the United States where there was a lot of illegal dumping of waste materials that took place during the 50s, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, before we had regulation against those activities. And those sites to this day remain contaminated. And so for many years, the thought was that's a brownfield. We cannot plant any type of vegetation on that because, especially consumable vegetation, because there can potentially be negative health impacts. But in the forestry community, we learned that yes, those soils may be contaminated, but there are tree species that can be planted there. And so we have moved towards the technique of phytoremediation or dendroremediation, planting trees that will do well in those highly contaminated soils. And we found that certain species of poplars and willows not only are very tolerant to those pollution levels, but they also grow very quickly, sometimes upwards of 10 feet per year. And when they reach maturity faster, they're of a size of a biomass where they can actually provide those ecosystem services that we're intending them to provide. So I hope that that's in some way helpful.
Yes. But in just 1 minute, could you answer to this question? I think very important. So how do we finance, it's almost Mensa, private initiative in a sustainable manner in terms of preserving urban lands to urban forestry? Just in 1 minute. I know that it's not possible to answer. Just give you a chance.
Yeah, so I'll try. And again, I'm much more oriented with opportunities for funding in the United States, but there was an opportunity that I saw come through when looking at a potential project in Nigeria that I think it was through a British-based organization, but they were providing finances for sustainable urban development. So I would say look for those opportunities for funding. Some may be beyond the African continent, but look at those opportunities, potential to use them for land acquisition and maybe work on replanting forests in those small parks, if you will, like the New York City example, and then building from there.
Thank you. Pape Sakho, si tu es là.
Sakho, if you're still with us, a few questions. Pick this one, unless you pick another one. Because we're getting to the end, can you address to the question, the following question on why not diving deep into the history in order to revisit former methods. Papsaho, can you hear me? I think we.
Okay, je vais parler en anglais peut-être que.
I'll speak in English.
Pap, are you hearing me?
Maintenant, oui. Non, je vous entends pas. Est-ce qu'on peut répéter la question?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Are you hearing me?
Non.
Est-ce que tu m'entends?
Are you getting me? Can you hear me? Papsako, can you hear me?
Okay, je pense que tu n'es pas, tu as dû changer
I think you probably changed your device or your channel.
Okay.
I think you changed channels. If someone can help him with the technology, I would like him to address a question raised by Mohammed Abdurrahman Hussein. Mohammed Abdurrahman Hussein.
Papsaho?
Papsaho, can you hear me?
Okay, so
Sorry, we lost Papsaho. We cannot reach him, sorry. So getting back to others, Papsaho, can you address the question raised by Mohammed Abdurrahman Hussein?
Okay, no, maybe I will give this question to Kultum from Amadou Cissé.
Je vous entends maintenant.
Ah, oui, voilà, on est vraiment à la fin.
We're at the very tail end of this dialogue. Could you address the question raised by Mohammed Hussein? Can you read it? Why not dive deep into history in order to revisit the former methods on climate change? What are the ways and means in order to reinforce access to research for this climate adaptation, etc., etc.? Can you address this question raised by Mohammed Abdurrahman Hussein? Papsaho, can you hear me?
Okay, so he's not here. So let me come to Kultum. Can you answer to that question of Amos Mensah? This question is, do we source financial support to finance local adaptation and mitigation actions? If Kultum is here, could you try to answer to that question?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
I didn't get the question. Are you talking about financial support?
Oui,
yes.
Je crois qu'il y a quelques soucis de connexion.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
I seem to have an interruption, but I'll try and go ahead anyway. I was going to talk about the possibility, the quite under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's various channels that you can use as African countries, as developing countries, to access financing for climate change initiatives. What has been done right now, which is what the Africa group has been pushing for, is countries being able to access the funds directly. We call it the direct access modality, where you don't have to go through organizations such as your World Bank or your UN agencies. You can actually access the funding. You are entitled to access the funding yourself as a country. You would need to speak to your national climate change focal points to see what the options are, but this funding is there. Through the Adaptation Fund, you can get up to $10 million for initiatives and projects that address adaptation. And through the Green Climate Fund, it can go quite high, much higher than that. So I would really urge you to talk to your national focal points to see how best you can access this. There's a lot of funding for climate change. And unfortunately, if you look at access rates for African countries, it's very low. And it is time for us to get this funding to assist us to deal with these adverse impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Okay, so I can give chance to just one answer. I do somebody who want to take it can take it. So it's a very general question. It's the role of universities, academia, and wider research community in understanding climate change and managing its effects. It's from Marina Waruru. So if Bay, can you answer to that one? And it will be the last Q&A. Is Bay here? Asia, Dr. Asia, do you think you can answer to that one?
Absolutely. I think the role of universities, has historically been to conduct the research, but I think thankfully in the past, there's been more of a charge in the past few years to ensure that the research that's being conducted doesn't stop at a journal article or isn't limited to being presented at, an exclusive conference. Instead, there's more of an effort to engage in science communication. And I think that universities moving forward need to continue to put that effort forth to communicate the findings of our scientific research to a broad array of various stakeholders. So, if you want to think about it in terms of educating the public, there are a lot of scientists that are doing that now on Twitter and other forms of social media, which is great for general education. And I think strategically there has to be various forms of written and oral communication that also gets this information to community decision makers, including those who work at local, state, and higher levels of government. And so I think the role of universities now is to continue to put forth the effort to connect with those stakeholders, to understand what are the best ways to deliver the science so that it can be well received and interpreted by those stakeholders, and then to put forth the work to figure out those forms of effective communication.
Thank you. Really, thank you all the panelists. And I think we need to give you all a round of applause. I think I can talk at the name of all the participants from Africa and US and elsewhere. And we can really say that we learn a lot. We learn a lot, and the main message I got here is the idea of really strengthening partnership, developing again partnership and collaboration, and also of course the need, if you want really to be useful for climate adaptation for African cities. There's a need really to engage all the communities and also to work toward the community's engagement. So of course, this has also to go at the same time than the production of knowledge. We know that we have a lot to learn because of climate change is very fast, and fortunately and hopefully we have also already solutions. And there's even in your presentation of all of you, we did learn a lot on some case studies, but it means that, of course, if together we can produce knowledge and as a community, and we really will be really able to find solutions and contribute to a more sustainable cities, better and I can say we can really help on green cities in Africa and resilient to climate change. So thank you again for organizing this, AAP, Michigan State University, and UCAD. Thank you again for attending, to all the participants. Thanks to all the speakers for your very, very nice talks and very interesting. And again, hope to see you and meet you all in the next webinar organized by AAP. Thank you. Bye-bye, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.